to join the call. And thank you so much, Eleanor, for starting the recording. So welcome everybody to Missing and Murdering Indigenous Relatives and Trafficking Prevention 101. We have amazing, these amazing women, Shayla and Rebecca from Minnesota Indian Women's Sexual Assault Coalition. And so we're just, very sorry. I just scrolled on my mouse. I didn't want to look too quick, but we're going to get started. The National American Indian Alaska Native Childhood Trauma Treatment Service and Adaptation Center is supported by a grant from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, which is SAMHSA. And the content of this event is the creation of the presenters, and the opinions expressed do not necessarily reflect the views or policies of SAMHSA, HHS, or the NCTSN. Before we fully get started into the content, if you could all take a moment to read our land acknowledgement. These were developed by 3 of our coworkers who are Meskwaki and Winnebago, as well as, Meskwaki and Winnebago. I was going to say the third one, but it's Meskwaki as well. So I'm going to give everyone a couple of minutes and then we'll get started. Right. Thank you all for taking the time to read our land acknowledgement. So in follow-up of this presentation, links to the presentation slides will be provided, but for sure a recording will be posted on the Native Center for Behavioral Health YouTube, as well as on our website at nativecenter-ttsa.com, I believe. Resources and links will be shared in the chat, as well as a link to our evaluation survey. Just a disclaimer before we start, this presentation and discussion may evoke strong feelings related to one's past traumas. So just know that this is a safe place and feel free to express yourself in a respectful way. And if you have any questions, we will be saving them for the end of the session, or if they're in the chat and Shayla and Rebecca believe they're relevant, they may respond to them. This is them presenting and we are very appreciative. So really quick, this is our co-director, Teresa Brewington. She is co-Harry and Lumbee, and she is the co-director of the National American Indian Alaska Native Mental Health TTC K-12 program, as well as the co-director for the National American Indian Alaska Native Childhood Trauma Center. She holds a business administration degree, as well as a master's in educational leadership. And she lives on the Meskwaki settlement with her family. As you've already heard from me a little bit, my name is Liz Sadoff. I am the program coordinator for the National American Indian Alaska Native Childhood Trauma TSA. I have a master's in public health and community behavioral health, as well as certified in health education teachings. And Eleanor is present in the chat, but she is unavailable to speak. She is our amazing graduate student that works on this project. She is going through the school counseling program at the University of Iowa, and she has been an amazing help throughout this entire project. And with that, I will be handing it over to Rebecca.
Day. Hi, everyone. I'm Rebecca Balog. I'm really excited to be here with y'all. I'm sitting here in sunny Arizona today. So that's a bit of our background or behind where we're sitting. So I don't want to read this. You'll have the PowerPoint presentation available to you. I live on the East Coast on the Appalachian Mountains, 15 miles from the Carlisle Indian School. I am Oglala Lakota and Mohawk on my mom's side, and my father is Hungarian Slovak Gypsy. Like I said, I am a survivor, and because I'm a survivor, I've been doing the work for 23 years now. I started in domestic violence, homeless shelters, sexual violence, mental health, substance abuse. I'm not going to go through the list because I think many of us understand all of the many intersections in the work and as survivors and in our families and communities. So yeah, I'm really excited to be here today through the Minnesota Indian Women's Sexual Assault Coalition. And this is through the Office on Violence Against Women, Sex Trafficking in Indian Country Grant. So yeah, and I'll let Shayla introduce herself.
Danse Nisi Gosawin, Shayla Beaumont. I'm an enrolled member of the Chippewa Cree tribe, but I'm also Crow, Grovant, and Assiniboine. I work with Minnesota Indian Women's Sexual Assault Coalition as the Elevate Uplift Coordinator. And I have served as a domestic violence advocate, human trafficking, and sexual assault. My career started in local shelters in Missoula, Montana, working with all age groups. I worked with Child Protective Services and has served as a director for Indigenous human trafficking program as well in Missoula. I've graduated with my Bachelor of Arts in Criminal Justice, and I just have a passion for educating on these topics. And thank you for sharing the space, and please take care of yourself. And yeah, thank you.
Thank you both for introducing yourself. And with that, I am going to stop sharing and hand it over to our amazing speakers.
Awesome. Can you screen share? So while we're getting our PowerPoint up, I just want to do a little bit of housekeeping. I'm really grateful for the disclaimer because this conversation can get rugged. It's difficult. I hope it doesn't trigger anyone, but a part of our survivor stories is a part of our work and why we're here. So we'll be sharing from the stories we've been gifted from survivors. We'll be making I statements about the work we've been doing, and also hopefully giving you background information on what survivors are going through since 1491, keep it real, right? But then also what's happening today on, November 17th. So a part of that disclaimer, we want to hear from you. You're the experts in your own community. You're the experts in your family. You can interrupt us at any time. We will not be offended. You can be on camera. You can have camera on, off. You can do audio on, off. You can also type in the chat, whatever your comfort level is. Do you need help? Sorry. So yeah, whatever your comfort level is. We're not going to read every single slide because you'll have access to those. But if some folks are on the phone, we'll make sure that we get the protein and of the meat of the slide into our, we'll be reading somewhat. Okay, so I'm just gonna, so sorry, we're just doing some techie things. Do this. It's not going to go horizontal. Oh, there it is. This. Doing the clicky things, y'all. Okay, so okay, the goals and objectives, it's a discussion. We're hoping to have a discussion together, ask as many questions as you like, but we want to just provide a basic understanding with you all of what sex trafficking is. We're also going to broaden just a little bit because sex trafficking intersects heavily with murdered and missing Indigenous relatives. It intersects with human trafficking, labor trafficking, and other forms of exploitation. So the first thing we want to talk about is the simple definition, and in there, the objective, that sex trafficking is violence, it's exploitation. We also want to provide you with trauma-informed language, but we also want to give you the actual language that's used in the life on the street. So there may be a few swear words that are going to be said, but it's not to be disrespectful to you. It's to keep it real with you all, so you're aware what language means. If you hear it within your families or communities, you'll understand what that word means or what this saying means. We also want to share that sex trafficking is a multi-billion-dollar corporate, structured, managed industry. It's not just one person, it's not just gangs, it's not just happening in transportation areas or casinos, it's not the movie Taken only. There are structures of corporate crime involved in a lot of sex trafficking rings, so we want to dispel some myths. And then also identify the warning signs. We're going to talk about grooming. We're going to talk about digital trafficking. We're going to talk about back in the day and what's happening today, so you all have that, you're equipped with the information. Oh, and identify services and advocacy strategies. So at the end of our presentation today, we're going to give you some access points for Native folks. We're going to give a hotline for that. And for non-Native and allied folks, there'll be a hotline number too.
Yeah, so human trafficking definitions, prostitution versus sex trafficking. When we're working on human trafficking, you know, a lot of beliefs are that sex trafficking is prostitution, but we wanted to really clarify prostitution versus sex trafficking. So prostitution, exchanging sex for food, money, housing, transportation, safety, visitation, drugs, and or favors, versus sex trafficking, which is recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, or obtaining of a person for the purposes of a commercial sex act, in which the commercial sex act is induced by force, fraud, or coercion, or in which the person induced to perform. Oops.
Oh, we got to do the clicky things. Apologies. How do we? Oh, I know what to do.
Just hide it.
There we go.
Sorry.
Clicky things.
Or in which the person induced to perform such an act has not attained 18 years of age.
And we'll get into that more too. The age actually has jurisdictional and prosecution impacts, including and services and advocacy. What's available changes between being under the age of 18 versus being above the age of 18. So we'll get into that. And here is a bit of that. So in our work, we're federally funded. When it comes to prosecution and jurisdiction, sometimes medical services and survivor services, human trafficking has to fall within 3 official federal categories, and that's force and fraud or coercion. Again, sex trafficking for anyone under the age of 18 is a sex trafficking survivor or victim automatically. We talked about prostitution in the last slide. That means someone over the age of 18 could be arrested for prostitution, even if they're being trafficked because of corruption or how the police department defines it, what's the scenario, someone being seen on the street, all of the different impacts or inlets rather. But if someone is arrested at the age of 18, they're released and brought into youth service providers that are available for sex trafficking victims. Again, they cannot be arrested if they're under the age of 18. Same thing, Section B, recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, all of the things. Again, force, fraud, and coercion. That can also include involuntary servitude, which also happens in sex trafficking. Sex trafficking survivors and victims sometimes are also rolled in the life to also be trafficking drugs or selling drugs. You have to excuse my simple language for it, but they have to have their main job being trafficked, doing the sex work. Then they're also forced through violence, force, fraud, and coercion to run drugs or also do labor trafficking, right? Sometimes and all of that spectrum from housework to cooking for the stable. A house full of sex trafficking survivors is called a kennel or a stable. They may have requirements to keep the house running on the inside. So that's also labor trafficking. So all of these intersections are combined. Are there any questions? I'm going to do the clicky thing. Sure. Come on, chat. Oh, yes. Thank you, everyone, for announcing yourselves. Awesome. Okay, with that, I'm going to pass it to Shayla for the next slide. Okay.
So we wanted to touch on the Safe Harbor Law 2011. It was fully implemented in 2014. And that was just kind of when when human trafficking, just trying to educate law enforcement prosecution of what is really happening within human trafficking instead of assuming it's prostitution. So persons under age of 18 are considered sexually exploited if they engage in any commercial sexual activity. And then to the definition, it was added of sexually exploited youth into Minnesota's child protection codes. We see a lot of human trafficking within our child protective systems. Increase the penalties against convicted purchasers, which are the ones who are buying sex from trafficking survivors and victims. Because before they were just let off easy off the hook when you get the survivor who gets a felony of prostitution, but the person who's engaging and purchasing her just got hands off free with the slap on the wrist, nothing. Directed the Department of Public Safety to create a victim-centered statewide response for sexually exploited youth.
And these are just, so we're from the Minnesota Indian Women's Sexual Assault Coalition. Of course, every state is going to have, there's 33 states that actually have safe harbor law. So I would check with your state and the states of your relatives if you're focusing on sex trafficking, if you're fearful of your family being sex trafficked, see if your state has safe harbor laws. They're all different. This is just an example. They're not, it's federal, but it's also state managed and mandated. Also, not every tribe has tribal version of safe harbor law. So check with your tribe and your tribal community too, because they will be different. And these are just examples. So we won't, I don't think we need to continue because it's just an example and may not apply to you. So we're just going to skip through that. You'll have them to check in the PowerPoint slides that you have as a resource. So trafficking and other forms of violence. This is what we kind of did in our introduction too, like trafficking intersects with murdered and missing, which is, to my knowledge, and there's no report on this yet, but in my experience, sex trafficking is one of the most prevalent intersections to murdered and missing because of the intersections of runaway homeless youth, substance abuse, the amount of fatalities of sex trafficking victims that they don't get to escape because of the stalking and all of the violence of being owned and enslaved, their property. So many people don't make it out of the game or of the life. So with that said, it also intersects with child abuse, and that goes through family trafficking happening from generations, grandma, grandpa, uncles, mom, dad, and all of the other things, leading to child sexual abuse, child domestic violence, basic child abuse, and all other intersections like drugs coming through the home, domestic violence. We'll get into these much more detailed later, but it intersects with domestic violence. Many sex trafficking survivors are groomed and brought in through love and partnership, or sometimes a guardian or parent. So that's a part of it too. It is sexual assault because it's sex trafficking. And then what else?
I think you covered a lot of it.
Yeah. We'll get into a lot of the what else's too later. Does anyone want to chime in? Any other forms of violence that you all think is a part of trafficking that intersects with violence?
Financial.
Boom. Thank you. Yeah. When someone is being trafficked, at the end of the day, they're experiencing sexual violence, and then they're making money for that industry we were talking about, or who they believe to be their boyfriend, and they do not get to keep the money. Oftentimes they're not even fed, and they're punished if they don't make enough money. They don't get to eat, or they have to sleep on the floor, or there's violence.
Steve also said SUDs.
What is it?
SUDs.
Substance use disorders.
Oh,
Yes, thank you. Yes. And this one is rugged too. We'll talk about it later, but also there's a unfortunate reality. You know, there's homicide and fatalities, of course, with murdered and missing, but there's also suicide, especially when someone tries to escape and they will the John or the pimp will not stop stalking them or their family. So there's a lot of suicide as well.
One, too, that's not really talked about, I believe, is sexual exploitation in ceremonies.
Thank you.
Like our Native American ceremonies. In like, you don't talk about like, oh, that guy, don't go around that guy or whatever. It's like, we need to get rid of that guy. Like, he's not allowed here anymore, or girl. I mean, you know, it could be either one.
That's so true. And that's brilliant. And I'm just getting all these popcorn thoughts happening, thinking about how our communities protect those spiritual leaders, that folks know that things are going on, but yet many of the community followers or the people under that altar will protect the abuser. So it's very difficult to break that cycle and make change, right?
It is. And just, I'm sorry for chiming in. I can't type very fast, but I think for me, I spoke up and got rid of somebody in my community, but what came with that was death threats to my other jobs line, and so, because this was a man, and I didn't know him personally for very long, and it wasn't even why he was fired, but it was because he wasn't doing his job. And then all this nasty stuff came out. Well, that would have been the reason that I fired him. And I feel like people just don't want to have that intimidation or what, because I was getting death threats and I had to tell family, like, if I die, it's because of this, what happened. And that's just the reality of it. And I feel like I have a 19-year-old daughter, so that's why I did it. And so I don't know. It's hard. It's hard because, like, I'm willing to live for my daughter, but I'm also willing to die to protect her. And so it's hard to speak up. But I know I talked to some people and law enforcement, like, I'm about to do this and I need you to know why. And so thank you for letting me say that.
Yeah, thank you for speaking on that.
I know we have like a couple messages in the chat as well. So Williamette said work related, and Mitchell said the emotional turmoil from being raised to believe normalcy and instill hopelessness. Belinda said 3 threats to their children and forced drug abuse, as well as Caroline gave a great description of, it was described to me once that trafficking is all the power and control dynamics of domestic violence, plus the added element of money to intensify the situation. And Mitchell added to their comment, hiding the abusive acts behind acceptable behaviors or acts. And then Shane has his hand raised.
Hi, Shane. Thank you for reading this. Appreciate that.
Hello. I'm just trying to get situated here. Sorry. So, I'm hearing all these different ideas of possibilities of how these things can happen. I'm a person of long-term recovery, and I would see this kind of behavior kind of happen at AA meetings. And luckily, I was able to witness what was acceptable and what wasn't, because there was enough people who would say, kind of shoo away it was usually a guy, but shoo away the guy and, kind of banished from that home group or whatever. And, it wouldn't stop there. They would just kind of like cycle and like go through like another place where nobody knew them. And so I would like to think that, I haven't seen it, but I guess it's a possibility that these things can happen. If they're at ceremonies, I mean, what's to say that these kind of things don't happen when nobody's watching at like the talking circles and things like that. Possibly even powwows, the ones who go camping, and those kind of things. So that was just my 2 cents.
No, thank you for that a lot, Shane. In our tribal communities, not a lot of people think that trafficking happens in our cultural activities, just like you mentioned, like powwow and ceremony. So thank you very much for highlighting that.
And I want to add real quick too that that was perfect timing, because we're going to get into that too. But I had that popcorn thought that what you just shared with the AA meetings and the powwows and casinos and talking circles and life skills classes and beading classes, at the end of the day, these are business people or in it for the paper and the coin, and they look for the most vulnerable people that are the easiest to groom and recruit. So you gave me an opportunity to share that just now. So that's brilliant because that's what they look for. They go to AA meetings because they're looking for folks who are looking for something or needing something or in a healing journey, or they're going to powwow and maybe they're shy or they're not there with a big family and they're standing alone. That's what they're looking for, that vulnerable opportunity. So,
And even in places like shelters, right, where people go to find that safe space. And then we also have traffickers showing up trying to recruit or just find vulnerability. No, so we just wanted to talk a few parallels to domestic violence and or sexual abuse. So in trafficking, domestic violence, the abuse but in the relationship, and in trafficking, recruitment or when exploitation starts, she thinks that they are in a loving relationship. She thinks that he is her committed partner or that they are in a committed relationship. But really he just turns out to wanting to exploit her by recruiting her through that promising relationship, putting his needs over her own. A lot of that love bombing, right? Feeling like he saved her life just because he treats her well. Maybe she comes from a previous violent relationship or violence at home. And snowballing off of that, she has nowhere to go or leave, or him or her, sorry. And then that experience, rationalizing the abuse, blaming themselves, thinking it's their fault, that exploitation, that grooming, whatever it may be, losing family and friends, job, addiction, isolation. We see a lot of that in that power and control in domestic violence, isolating you from your family and friends. Do you want to get this one?
yes. So we're doing all the clicky things. Oh, no. I don't know what the title says. Okay. So possible grooming tactics. And I like what Shayla had just talked about because there's the Duluth model of power and control. And many of you may have seen it in your work and in the world, but it's a big pie chart and has all of these different pies, and it's isolation, it's psychological abuse, it's emotional abuse, financial abuse, spiritual abuse. So it has all of these pies to describe domestic violence. That was created 20 years ago in Duluth. Now there is a sexual assault wheel, very similar, but the sex trafficking pie chart is an exact replica with just different descriptors of how the domestic violence wheels, that isolation, financial abuse, emotional abuse, physical. The content of the wheel, the definitions are different because it's woven into sex trafficking, but the titles are mimicked. It's an exact replica in that term. So when in that other slide, domestic violence and sex trafficking, just like this, they're like so tightly woven together. And in domestic violence, the grooming tactics of domestic violence can grow over time, or there could be a perpetrator, he or she can be looking for a vulnerable individual to have power and control over. So that's a part of their dating ritual, to look for a certain type of person. That's what traffickers do. So the grooming for sex trafficking, also DV, that sweet talking, you see someone who's in need of love and affection. It could be a runaway homeless youth, doesn't have a home. Hey, baby, I'll take care of you, come to me. Or it could be, which is like a half an hour conversation if someone wants to get off the street. Or there are groomers that will groom for 3 years. They go full on and they'll go baby steps and slowly manipulate and sweet talk that person to fill their stable or their kennel. Or if it's just one dude, some dudes, or not dudes, some people just want one trafficking victim as a part of their income, for lack of a better word. They also try to make people feel special, like love bombing. That's a part of grooming. Gifts, phones, clothes, new sneakers, kicks, powwow gear, anything is on the table that's part of their love bombing. I got this for you. I'm loving you. I'm sweet talking you. Now you got to do this for me. You owe me now. You can't do this for me. We need the money. We need the paper. We got to pay the rent. all of these things start happening. Again, runaway homeless youth, a safe place to stay. This is true love. If you love me, you will do this for me. A big part of keeping people subdued emotionally, physically, psychologically is access to drugs and alcohol to mute the emotions. That's just a way to keep people, what's the word I'm looking for? Brainwashed or vulnerable.
Easy to manipulate and control.
Yep. You got to help you pay the bills. Oh, and this is a big one. Just do it this once for me. That's a grooming technique, like the gateway conversation. Or you owe me. Again, I'm not going to read all of these. We do know the intimidation, but some of that psychological abuse isn't as easy to identify as the physical harm.
Mhm.
But a lot of the things used are, you're crazy. What do you mean I'm trafficking you? You did it. You may have said no 80 times, but you did it. It was your choice. So then there's that gaslighting effect. You're stupid, you're ugly, no one else would want you. And all of that psychological and verbal abuse is a part of that grooming and maintaining them in their kennel or stable. Threats to self, family, and pets. There are stories where people tried to flee, they escaped. They were isolated from their family, but when they got out and ended up in a safe space or a shelter or whatever, their pets were threatened, some were harmed, family members threatened or harmed, houses being broken into, all acts of violence to destabilize the person who's trying to be free.
Or that retaliation of escaping just can,
Yep.
just like domestic violence, right? We think when a survivor leaves, that's the safest time, when actually it's the most dangerous time. They want to regain that access and control of them. They need that control back. So they will do whatever they need to attain that back.
Yep.
Like we mentioned, there's so much money in this industry, and it's so much violence that go into keep that coming in, to keep trafficking survivors and victims under control. And yeah.
And that you made me just think of something too. So I want to do a little storytelling. This, I'm going to keep it all confidential. You know, like symbols or anything, but there was a tribal community that had a shelter. It was a DVSA shelter. They didn't have a whole lot in their program for sex trafficking, but one of their tribal members was being trafficked by a gang that was close to a military base. So this executive director called and asked for help because she left this formidable sex trafficking pimp group and she escaped and was hiding in their shelter. Well, they were stalking her, and I meant it was gang violence, gun violence, threats. The staff at the shelter and the program were being threatened. The executive director was sleeping in the shelter and never going home, and having the police patrolling because the stalking and the retaliation, they're going to get their money. So it is a human being that they're trying to find. So even shelter programs have to have extra safety precautions when they take in a survivor because of that retaliation.
And even working, like I mentioned before, in my introduction, working as even being a direct response and being even being mindful of your safety for helping women, whether it's maybe not them fully escaping, but even just offering that empathy and that emotional support and that cultural access to them. And even our safety, in Missoula, Montana, I survived 5 kidnapping attempts within the last 2 years. And, just even making sure that safety for our organizations helping as well for retaliation or.
Are there any comments in the chat that you'd like to read out?
Right now, there are multiple comments about the casino environment, as well as Rebecca shared a personal story about what was going on at Ceremony, where there was a power structure where leadership fired an individual that was sexually assaulted, and then lady leadership stood behind them and still faced backlash. They're talking about the books like The Art of Seduction are often used, as well as talking about fostering youth and the laundering of money, as you both have mentioned. And just having relatives stay with you is a huge but generational thing. Also having family protect the predator is an issue. And then Mitchell said, the more dependent on others for establishing values in oneself, the suggestible or naive, it is the good-hearted and natured, the sheep among wolves, or even the altruistic, just as much as those who are afflicted from a young age of mental health or substance dependency. Sorry, that was a lot of comments all back to back.
I love it. Thank you so much for chiming in. And if anyone wants to unmute, just interrupt. We will not be offended. The last one, and I'll pass it to Shayla. We're going to get into the digital stuff, but the pornography, retaliation, I'm going to send this picture to everyone, all the things, or OnlyFans, and we'll talk about it later. But pornography is one of those second jobs that a lot of trafficking victims had to go through, especially when COVID happened, because the money wasn't on the street. So they adapted into digital ways. Anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, and then, you know, just with our whole world going digital, a lot of that present online now, and just learning how to battle that, and stepping up our security for our kiddos and just for all of our safety online. You know, with COVID, we couldn't be in public spaces. We couldn't be near people. We all had to go in quarantine. We all had to be on our computers. So just keeping that in mind.
And that's
I-
what
I'm sorry.
Here.
I just want to add something real quick. It's kind of a personal thing. I don't know if anybody's ever said anything, mentioned this before. When I was a kid, you know, like my family went to church on our reservation. There was this one guy. I always had like a bad energy about him. I think he was like the pastor, the preacher, whoever he was. And when I got older, I realized energy doesn't lie. So if I feel uncomfortable around somebody, that's a red flag. So I expressed that later on in life. And then I had an aunt who was loyal to that church. And she just says, well, you're just not used to being around good-hearted people. So she, you know, lit me and kind of used that as a distraction. But ultimately, like, I was wrong for even bringing it up. But I'm seeing this in a lot of different places where people are in those positions are being like held in high regard, but you have the elders or whoever goes to that church, like protecting that person, and that person is to never be questioned. And if you are, then maybe you're bad and you're wrong and all these other things. So that's another thing that I see that happens that possibly could relate to what we're talking about today or right now.
100% related. Yeah, oh yeah. That's that power. And at the end of the day, we're at a conference, and we were just talking about this in the big session, that violence is power and control. You bring in money, and then it's more power and more control and more violence with it. So yeah, that power and control dynamic and people being protected. I don't know if you want to do any storytelling on that.
No, I was just thinking of those grooming tactics, right? Like this priest was just, or I'm sorry, the church, the man who was working, the priest, right? And just like all the, he had a high, powerful place, right? And he was able to, like, you sensed it, your intuition, you know, there's something not right, but just like traffickers are, and even domestic violence abusers, right? Like they're really good at manipulating people around them, making them believe that they are charming, they're respectable, they're a safe space, and
sacred. We're sacred.
And yes, that just, no, thank you for sharing that. That's
Yeah.
And then Mitchell is unmuted and has his hand raised as well.
I just wanted to mention too what Shane was saying about all the people that are getting protection with the stuff from the schools coming out, that these things have been happening and they've just been swept under the rug, or like they happen and people know about it, but this person moves to another community and nobody warns the community that this person does these tactics, and it happens over and over and over again.
Thank you so much. So I just had another popcorn. So I live 15 miles from the Carlisle Indian School, the boarding school. I'm sure everybody knows about it. And you know, sex trafficking can even be a micro situation where, you know, the kids were removed and taken to the school, and it planted seeds of domestic violence, children that didn't know love, or because they had no aunties, parents, grandparents, cousins, they weren't allowed to speak their language, all of the things. But within that violence, there was structure where student was pitted against student. And there was a lot of sexual violence happening in that school. But it wasn't always as it would seem that that it was just assault. There was exchanges and transactional things where there were nuns that were rapists, and also teachers and the military folks that were there would, molest, pedophilia, and introduce sexual violence into the student body. But there was transactional where a student could get extra food. There was the bribery and the grooming. It wasn't just what we imagine in violent attacks, but it was also transactional. Like I said, food, or they got more time in the yard, or they had less chores. So that was a form of trafficking too, back in the day.
Or if they were promised safety of themselves, if they
Correct.
were to groom other kiddos or do other acts on like whoever, like even just doing that for their own safety, like we talked about in the
Yeah.
boarding schools, a lot of physical abuse, a lot of sexual abuse happened there. So, just trying to manipulate them with their own safety for inflicting exploitation or violence on other students or whoever it may be.
Any other thoughts or questions before we go to the next? Listina. Okay.
I just wanted to add something if I could.
Yes, we can.
I feel like I'm interrupting, but
Oh, please.
so I'm not gonna say where this happened. There was someone who was brought on, hired by a tribe, and they were a fluent speaker. 'Cause in our region it's called Anishinaabe Moen, so Ojibwe, Potawatomi, Odawa, and I'm a student myself. I'm constantly learning it, and next thing you know, like this person like no longer was working for this tribe anymore, and then I found out there's somebody else that this person was kind of like always being nice to the younger women, and like you said, being charming and all these other things. And then I found out like that was his thing, where like he knew that he possessed a lot of knowledge through the language, because he's a fluent speaker, and a lot of people aren't. And so he used that as an advantage to kind of win over the younger women, or just women in general. So it's everywhere. I mean, it's pretty sad.
Mhm.
Thank you. That's very true. That charming transactional vulnerability, people that are looking for language or a teacher to learn, our ways have been taken away in 1,000 different ways. So yeah, that is a vulnerability. It's just so maniacal and twisted, and it can be very sinister. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
And it's everywhere, right? It's in council and schools and churches and ceremony, at powwows, casinos, rodeos, basketball tournaments, skate jams. The list goes on and on.
So we just wanted to talk about some of the possible effects of experiencing human trafficking. In a spiritual, emotional level, a lot of fear, a lot of distrust, PTSD. Oh, sorry, that's listed. Like Rebecca said, suicidal thoughts, a lot of the MMIW movement, a lot of intersections with human trafficking, MMIW. And when we do think of murder a lot of times, but when you do escape, whether it's retaliation, we forget about the suicidal part. Avoidance of spiritual and culture and traditions, maybe that trafficking happened in a cultural ceremony or in a cultural setting, and just instead of reaching out to your culture for healing, you want to avoid that. Maybe it triggers you. A lot of health disparities, PTSD, phobias, depression. Maybe you don't want to be connected to your family and friends anymore out of your safety or theirs.
And then some of the other trauma can show up like it's everything, and right, it's not, and we're just given like basics of what we've learned across the years with MIWSAC, but sometimes it shows up like an eating disorder or body dysmorphia, fear of always being watched, like always on guard, because their trafficker could be looking after them 10 years later. And I'll do a tiny storytelling again. I did get a crisis call from an individual who had gotten out of the life like for 10 years or something. And as soon as COVID hit, it hit the traffickers and the pimps, you know, hit their wallets, it hit their business model. So they started looking back on who used to be in their kennel, who were they selling, and they were hunting people down. And this individual was suicidal because this person found her on Facebook, ended up finding where she was living. She ended up fleeing her apartment and moved into a homeless shelter and stopped the shelter. So this individual became suicidal years after getting out of the game and getting out of the life because it hit their money. So they came searching for people that had already started the healing process, rebuilt their lives, reestablished family ties. And so that's just something I wanted to share too. Do you want to do this one? You could do it. So the physical effects, it's everything but here are just some examples. That violence can be critical. It can be broken bones, hospital visits. We are working with some programs and survivors where they're explaining when they go in for medical treatment. The police are called if they're over the age of 18, you know, if they go to jail, it's not the buyers, it's not the sellers. They're not readily available because the survivors are working on the streets. They go into the hospital or the clinic. They don't always get treated with respect. There's a lot of side eye and eye rolling and judginess that happens. So
A lot of
that's
victim blaming too.
victim blaming, yeah. And there can be lifelong chronic pain because of the physical assault and the violence that can happen in the moment of trafficking that's happening or through the violent punishment of their trafficker. PTSD, you know, that comes with trouble concentrating, migraines, traumatic brain injury. It can, you know, affect our, like all things and stressful traumas in our life can affect our digestive systems, dizziness, you know, reproductive justice too. There can be unwanted pregnancies, which is a hot topic politically right now. And rape and sex trafficking is a part of that discussion with Roe v. Wade. Forced addiction to keep them numb and to trick them and con them and keep them vulnerable or addicted that they have to stay because their bodies, you know, they use addiction as a tool. STDs and sexually transmitted injury. Yeah. And then every other physical effect, it's far and wide. Traffickers know that the tools they can use for a vulnerable person is going to be different from person to person. A trafficker would look at Shayla, understand Shayla, and understand that what her needs and vulnerabilities are and fears and traumas, and they would use that. They would find something else to use and manipulate within me and my fears. So, any thoughts or questions or unmutings?
Sure. On the last slide, what that would tell me, working in the disability, natives with disability like areas, all of those are disabilities. So when they have all of these disabilities, or they're going to have more than one, but then they're not using any of the resources, and really they should be, because the money that's out there for persons with disabilities, it's so high.
That is an awesome takeaway for us to remind that when we're working with programs to use that as a huge accessible resource. So thank you so much. Who
You're
was that?
welcome. Madonna.
Thank you.
Madonna, would you put your email in the chat? And
Sure.
maybe reach
Oh,
out?
I will. I think I did earlier, but and then so I'm going to put something else in the chat. It's to find a independent living center in your area. So I'm serving 4 counties: Mendocino, Sonoma, Lake, and Napa. But with reaching out to natives, like, you know, you meet people like I'm here, right? I'm doing outreach basically. And so I was able to talk with different women who were sexually exploited from the same medicine man in Canada and in the US, who now are using the services in their areas because they're independent living. Like in California, there's 28, because I talk with all 28 of those centers. So they're everywhere. They're in every state. They're in Canada, and just natives are not using them as much as they should be. And with all of this trauma and stuff, these are disabilities. And so just bringing that awareness to the room. Thank you.
That's
Appreciate
awesome. Thank you. We did this meeting.
Yeah, we just wanted to talk about some of the possible youth warning signs. We see a lot of recruitment through an older boyfriend, gangs, or truancy. A common tactic is to use peer groups to report at school. We also have our youth friends recruiting youth friends. I worked with a young male survivor who didn't have he didn't have too many friends, and a peer took advantage of that and gained his trust, and then it did lead to exploitation. Tattoos, brands, and injuries. Sometimes traffickers will have a consistent tattoo or type of branding on each of their trafficking victims. Sudden changes in daily activities. Are you noticing something different that they usually don't do? Whether that's going out with friends, are they not eating? Are their behaviors changing? Are they wearing more makeup? Risky use of technology, chat rooms, social media, Twitter, Snapchat is Snapchat. A lot of our kids use Snapchat. Age inappropriate knowledge of sex, STIs, not having that access, not having that education provided to them. You notice on their social media, they're behaving appropriately in their photos, or even maybe in their statuses or their postings, having unexplained money, drugs, or new clothes. Working with a student, why does she have $500, or why does she have so much money? He or she, sorry. Living in a house with frequent traffic, a lot of people coming and going missing for a long period of time. You can't visually see them. Starting to use substances. Sorry, I can't see this last one. Unable to speak for themselves or talk to you about what's going on with them. Did I leave anything out?
No,
What I don't see on this slide, I work with youth also, is they will be bruised up under where you can't see. Like on their legs, under their arms,
Their
where
clothing.
they're covered, where their clothes would normally cover them. They've showed me like this, he hit me with whatever, it could be a can, or a lint brush, on the legs, and they're just bruised, or, pinching under the arm, like kind of in public, like where no one could really see.
yeah.
So that's crazy.
And yes, thank you. And opposite of that, with that second, or I guess it's technically the third bullet, tattoos, brands. So those are exposed because like I live in the mountains of Pennsylvania, but Philadelphia is very close. And there is a trafficker, I'm not going to say his name for my own safety, man, but he has a brand that's a big butterfly. So his brand, so that the buyers on the street know he is, I don't even want to say reliable because that sucks. They understand what they're getting when they go to him. So he has a brand, and it could be a fetish. It could be an ethnicity or race. It could be anything that he wants his brand to be known for. So when I say brand, or when Shayla said brand, it's, a burned brand like on a cow with tattoos or actual branding, but it's also a brand name. It's marketing so that the buyers know that this individual belongs to this person, and they're familiar for like not getting arrested, or like I said, selling a certain fetish or flavor. Let me see what's next. I think. Okay. So we don't want to go through the warning signs of trafficking in adults because it mirrors, they flip-flop. What works for a youth may work for an adult. So they're very similar. So I don't want to waste time reading it, but I do want to do a bit of storytelling. Because I feel like this is how you're speaking to us and we're speaking to you about the realities of what we're really seeing, instead of just training with you on a PowerPoint, which, that's not our style. So COVID had happened. We were all sheltering in place. There was a reservation where there was a lot of youth that didn't have to go to school, right? So the kids were, middle school age kids were running around outside, yay, no school. Well, the perpetrators were and sellers, traffickers were losing their money on the street in the city. So they left the city and started snooping around the res and saw all these kids outside. So then they did that long-term grooming and found the kids, did the res Facebook page, found names, did their research, and then made friends online, digital grooming, and baby, I'm your man. I'm going to come pick you up, get as many girls as you can your age, and we'll go party in the city because I know you're bored. And it did take a little bit of time. The recruited 13-year-old, no, the recruiting girl was 15. She recruited 7, 8, 9 other youth to run away, and they went off res, got picked up in cars with, the boyfriend trafficker who was grooming them, and they trafficked them in the city for a very long time. And the reason I know this, it was the mother had called asking for crisis support and TA support with her tribal community to help. Oh my God, there was a runaway youth pact done by traffickers through digital media because of COVID. So that can happen to adults too, but our youth are more vulnerable because school was out. People that were monitoring them at school didn't happen. The parents were like, you don't have school, you're running around together, hanging out, playing, whatever. They're not monitoring their social media, and all of this happened. And that's a true story. And it's very scary. So the daughter of the mother I was working with, the child did come home through a friend of a friend that was actually speaking to her because she wasn't texting mom. And she came home pregnant, and she came home with $80 in her pocket, and she had been trafficked. And it's a tragic story, but it's a story worth telling of this is how it goes. This is the awful, the terrible loss and awful of it all. Anyway, any comments or questions? It is.
I'd like, hi, my name is Bev. I'm from Montana. And I came across a gal who had a barcode tattooed on her wrist. And it struck me right away because I thought, who would want that tattoo? It's so ugly. And then later I went to a sex trafficking presentation that was given by local law enforcement and learned that that's one of the ways they brand their victims. So I felt horrible because I didn't know the person who I saw that tattoo on. I'll be mindful now, but it grieves me that I couldn't go back and find that person.
Thank you for sharing that.
Mhm.
They come in all shapes and sizes. It could be a butterfly, a barcode. It could be a star. It could be anything. They just choose whatever they want to use. Yeah.
Mhm.
Thank you for that.
So our next slide, we're talking about possible signs to look for in the community. And, a lot of people, when we think about human trafficking, a lot of community members or a lot of people think of Taken, the movie being taken across seas or white vans and stuff, when human trafficking is happening all around us in the United States and our communities. So we just wanted to talk about some locations, casino, bars, restaurants, resorts. In Montana, we see a lot of trafficking in our skiing and snowboarding resorts, or large gatherings. Sporting events are huge for trafficking, hunting season, fishing tournaments, concerts, and maybe you're noticing a lot of unfamiliar people in your community. People that you've never seen before, but who are making more and more how am I trying to say it? Like they're just popping up in your community or in surrounding towns. Maybe the home doesn't look like, maybe the home looks suspicious. Why are the windows covered? Or why don't we see people or a lot of people coming in and out that look unfamiliar or that aren't a part of the family or the immediate family? Suspicious business fronts. Sorry.
That was me earlier.
I only had one coffee today, I'm sorry. Suspicious business fronts, a lot of massage and beauty parlors, nail shops, medical supplies. That is their front business, but underneath they may be participating in trafficking and exploitation. But I also just kind of wanted to hear from you all too, like maybe what you see or what I missed, or where else trafficking can happen around us.
Well, the chat is already ahead of you. So Nanny said highway rest stops, truckers rest stops. And then Mitchell said fairs or other big attractions or events, motels/hotels.
I didn't mention hotels.
Yeah, and so I want to honor all of our Indigenous relatives, right? So this is not just the lower 48. I want to bring in our Alaska relatives too, because when it comes to tourism, there's a lot of people that spend a lot of money to go out to Alaska to do hunting trips and things like that, or fishing trips. That is just another large gathering that they're scheduling their hunting tour while also planning for their sex tour, if that makes sense. Some people go to Thailand, they spend $10,000 to go on a sex trip, but people are going to Alaska with the expectation that they can find a trafficking victim. It's a part of their plan, man. It's terrible. And but I was gonna.
Oh, and then like
Yes,
even boats,
you. Yeah. Thank you.
Whether it's cruise ships or boats bringing in materials or supplies, we've seen a lot of women being lured onto those boats and then just taken, disappeared, or when we were talking about prostitution, survival sex is a thing as well, that maybe that's their only source of income sometimes. And some on the boats, when they go to those cruise ships, they're just, kidnapped and trapped, and they cannot escape.
And then the last one, is there any other thoughts? I don't want to.
The chat, Rosemarie said, here in Anchorage, our airport is a location for traffickers to pick up victims when they get off small planes from villages. Mitchell said online, especially dating or sites or forums like Reddit, like used to be Craigslist. Caroline said sporting events, the bigger the event, the bigger the trafficking market. And then Mitchell said near international waters with an exclamation point.
Yes, the ports are a big sex trafficking opportunity for the vultures that traffic and are recruiting. And then also I want to bring in our relatives in Alaska, but also now in the lower 48 and more so in the last 15 years, but it really exploded, is every extractive industry. The man camps, oh my gosh, our sex trafficking work exploded because of the man camps that were built up by the 3 affiliated tribes and the copper mines down in the Southwest. Well, that's where I am now, but the extractive industry is just, it doesn't have to be a powwow or it is a powwow, it is a sporting event, but it also can just be where there's an influx of huge cash and a lot of people with not much to do. And those are explicitly the man camps or on a boat, trapped on a boat. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Oh, okay. So outreach. So instead of reading the slide, which you all will have, and we've already talked about many of these things already, what are your thoughts for your community? What is outreach? If you could dream a dream of what you could do for outreach or what you're already doing in your community, what would that be? I'd love to hear stories on your end. So some examples.
So the biggest thing is support, having those supports and networks out there and being that support network for someone through the entire process and however that holds. I mean, that's one of the big things in advocacy, right? Getting people to be aware of it and to recognize it when they do see it, to say something to the proper things instead of shuffling it along to cover it, helping be part of the cover up.
Yeah, or like gossip, right? The moccasin trail, people gossip, like we know that person's doing this and that and the other. That's not helpful. And that happens a lot in our communities. So yeah, being a good community member. And this isn't a storytelling and it's very brief, but one of our partners in this work is from Canada. She's been trafficked internationally, including the lower 48. and she is a heck of a speaker. She's Ojibwe. She is in Canada right now. She's coming down to our sex trafficking conference. I'll tell you about that in a minute. But she said, you know what? And she said it to me on a moment like this on a webinar. She said, what I knew in my life are the traffickers. Even if I escaped, I got rolled back into the life by a new trafficker. And she said, you know what? Traffickers are in airports. They're in the bus stations and the truck stops. They're in the malls. They're everywhere. She said, you know what? If they're going to be everywhere, we need to be everywhere, right? So also talking to your families, having an age appropriate conversation at the school, the community center, have someone speaking at the powwow, right? Like Black Hills Powwow, we have the silent witnesses, and the local program has a special with a prize. And, you know, they do a special dance, so they get to have a contest and educate at the same time. So there's a lot of way of doing the outreach you just talked about. Because if they're everywhere, we're going to be everywhere. Any other thoughts?
I can share. So I'm a mom of a 19-year-old daughter, and I was a young mom, so I have a 28-year-old also, but he's a boy. So I wasn't as worried about him as I was for my daughter. But at that time, I made that promise to, okay, we're going to raise our children until they're 18, right? Well, we're still together now. I'm still with the father. And so for me, it's raising your child in a foundation where they don't need a hamburger, they don't need a pair of shoes, and if I would have been told, like, wait until you're 25 and your brain is fully developed, maybe you're going to give your baby a better chance at life. So that's just something, like with my daughter, teaching her, and she knows her brain's not fully developed. She knows that because I've been saying it her whole life, and having her talk with doctors and exposing her to anything and everything I can, but also not being afraid of her traveling, right? Like the Taken, that movie scares me, but I sent her to China when she was 13. And so that she could see the world and she could be whatever she wants to be and go and do whatever she wants to do. But it starts at home, I think. And I mean, I feel like I could have been sex trafficked because my mom was of poverty, but I just had culture to help me. And then I wasn't taken by any of those bad guys, but I think it's us raising our future generations to have good families. When I was little, my white friends, I wanted a mom and a dad and dinner together and, go to work in a good car. I wanted all of that because I didn't have that. I didn't have that support, and that's something I wanted to give to my kids, and I'm doing that.
That's
So
awesome.
that's what I think.
I love how that go mom. I love good moms and good parents and good aunties. And that leads me, popcorn thought, to the last speaker. I'm a child abuse survivor myself, and I had adopted moms, friends, parents would take care of me. And Shayla and I were just talking about this earlier, that if a child doesn't have a parent that in their own trauma, in their own addictions, going through their cycles of violence, often don't have the capacity to be a good parent, didn't have the leadership of someone to teach them how to do that possibly. So that's where our community comes together, where it does take a village, that we can informally adopt, come in for dinner, or help someone get clean clothes, or just keep an eye out for a child who doesn't have someone doing that.
And just being a good relative and offering that support, and just hoping we can minimize their vulnerabilities and
as a community.
Yeah.
And then the last one I'll read before I pass it to the next slide. This one is really, build strong collaborations with other social service agencies, programs, the medical clinic, law enforcement, the court system. Hopefully a healthy spiritual leader, right? Any matriarchal societies that are available in your community, whatever is there, build a network. Because that's, I think, a really effective way that we can respond medically, social services, housing, whatever it is that we're working together. And then be culturally informed. You know your tribal communities best. And I think that the answer to ending sex trafficking in your community is within your community. Yeah. All yours.
And also, like, you know, people are talking about, you know, ACEs, like my ACEs score is a 10, like I should be dead, right? But my resiliency is also a 10 out of the 14. So just teaching and being a safe person. And there's some other Madonna feathers in the chat. Those are colleagues that I invited here because this was sent to me very last minute. So my apologies for having other people in. But you know, awareness, kids are dying from fentanyl in my county. Getting out whatever we need, and we need everything and anything. Thank you.
Can I make a real quick comment about fentanyl? And this is something that it's not educated on enough. So fentanyl, I don't want to talk about that other than it's super addictive, it's super horrible, super toxic, and super cheap. Why traffickers are trafficking, because it's a human being. So if I have drugs in my hand, and when I sell it, I've got an empty hand. Why so many traffickers go into this horrible business model is because I have a hand. They can sell my hand again and again. They're selling parts of bodies over and over. You don't sell it once and it's gone. It's a commodity that's sold over and over and over again. So that's something a lot of folks don't understand, why the violence is so rugged when people, my phone's ringing, when people escape, that's why they're stalked, and it's so violent and scary in the most dangerous time, like Shayla was talking about, because it's a renewable resource of income for them. And that's why the violence can get so bad. So thank you for bringing up fentanyl.
So on our next slide, we just wanted to touch on advocacy. You know, educate your entire staff on trafficking, so survivors will not need to educate, especially our direct responders, right? Or anybody really. Sorry, this lawnmower is going on in the back. We're at a conference at a hotel. I really don't want to do too much reading off the slides because I really am just enjoying the feedback and hearing you all problem solve and just hearing your takeaways from your communities. But you know, just being patient and allowing that trust building, you know, that victim blaming, please do not judge. A lot of people are feeling shame and don't want to share their story, but I just would like to hear back from you too. Like, just what do you feel like is providing good advocacy or support?
I'll share again. During COVID, you know, people weren't at the office and stuff. And so people were not getting assistance because people were not calling back. And I feel like if you have a number out there, answer your phone, call them back, because it could be life or death. It could be them literally taking their own life or getting in that car with that guy. And if if you have a job, do it. If you you know, it's so easy and important. Just answer the phone, you know, or call right back.
And the unique thing about trafficking, so there's a lot of domestic violence and sexual violence programs out there, and the other intersections we had talked about, but there's not a lot of sex trafficking only programs where there's just educated and trained and fluent sex trafficking responders. So sex trafficking survivors, when they finally have the courage and the moment, just a minute to escape because the environment's right and the perpetrator's not there and the other people aren't there, they can escape. They're going to go to a domestic violence program or a sexual violence program. That's why cross-training is so very important, because sex trafficking survivors will not walk in like a domestic violence survivor who will say, I'm being abused. I was just sexually assaulted or raped. sex trafficking survivors have all these different levels of trauma that I've never, ever heard anyone ever walking in and saying, hello, I'm a sex trafficking survivor. They're not going to walk in with that. So in our programs, we need to, with all that we talked about, read between the lines, see what's being presented and look for the signs and symbols of it. And it may take 2 or 3 visits before you actually uncover and discover the person's been trafficked. So it takes a lot of patience, inner work.
And a part of that cross training too, you know, when we're looking for resources for our trafficking survivor, or when trying to connect them with resources, that cross training I think is just so important, because working, being a case manager of trafficking survivors, you know, we would run into shelters, we would run into rehabilitation centers, we would run into some resource would turn us away and just, I'm not capable, or I don't feel that I'm competent to offer services, when because they haven't provided that, they weren't provided that training, or they feel like they don't know how to work in human trafficking. We've heard domestic violence shelters say like, oh no, we're just domestic violence. We cannot provide human trafficking services.
Which just means someone got the guts to ask for help and had the only opportunity they may ever have, and then are turned away. So that's where that collaboration we had talked about earlier, of building a network, so this just doesn't ever happen, right? Okay, so language is powerful. I had talked about some street language. I just want you to know, is a pimp or a John. It's bottom bitch. Bottom bitch is not the bottom person in the kennel. It's the trafficker's right hand partner. They are also sex trafficking victims. They've been climbing up the corporate ladder, for lack of a better word, until they earn a space where they don't have to work on the street anymore. It is their job to recruit recruiters and keep the individuals in the kennel in line. And they often become violent perpetrators, but they started as a grooming victim into the trafficking game. This can be the LGBTQ community and Two-Spirit community, is all the things we've talked about since slide 1 as well. But I want you to understand that language is very important. Again, they're not going to walk in saying I'm a survivor of sex trafficking, but we do understand that survivor and victim is something for them to choose. And again, it may take 2 or 3 or 10 visits for them to even understand what they just survived was actually sex trafficking, when they think they've just been in a domestic violence scenario. So what else? Yep, went through that. Oh, and then the shame and the PTSD and the psychological needs. We want to be gentle and kind and understanding. And wherever you're sitting, if someone ever discloses to you or you want to help someone, you now have the foundational tools to know what to do. You can call the DV shelter. You can call the medical clinic. You can walk the journey with them as much as you can. If you need support, you can reach out to us anytime. This is what we do. We're TA providers. We're going to support you while you support others. Just know we're here for you. I think we already did that, right? Okay, that's good.
So impunity, whoops. Impunity as the norm. So trafficking rely on the pillars of oppression to keep the focus and blame on the survivors and keep buyers and traffickers invisible. Just like we talked about, you know, a lot of times when maybe if an arrest is made, instead of being looked at as a human trafficking victim, they're arrested for prostitution, like they're a criminal. Sexual exploitation takes place on a long continuum ranging from media to trafficking. Communities who experience increased oppression, you know, Native communities, LGBTQ, communities of color, disabilities are often invisible and not recognized as victims, or that they need support or services.
And then I think this is our last slide. We've done it together. You've done it with us. You've taught us things. I can't believe some of those great tips and takeaways we've gotten that we can go back and take to other programs and other survivors and service providers. So we're educating each other. That's what we do in our communities. That's what we do with our families. That's what we're doing today. But we want to keep ourselves continuing to educate, do the webinars, do the trainings, read the resources. because we don't want someone asking for help and have to be re-victimized by educating us on what sex trafficking actually means, right? So we want to know ahead of time. Acknowledge their invisibility can be very painful, and keep them in the center of their own stories in the most meaningful ways. Host community discussions. We have talked about that too. You can go to the powwow, you can have it in your community center, in schools, in your programs, with boards, with your tribal council, law enforcement. Sky's the limit. Keep the conversation going, because then we have more folks as a part of the community of prevention. And then use your cultural identity, use traditional values, use your medicine men and your healers, weave them into the conversation, and get those tribal codes updated for safe harbor, so that sex trafficking is also a part of your constitution. And don't give up. So, Wokula, thank you so much for having us here today. And we just want to open it to questions and comments, and then pass it back to our hosts.
I think it would be great for just a moment to take a moment to let all of the information settle. If you need a minute to take your camera off and just take a deep breath, please feel free to do that, and then we can open up to discussion. But thank you so much for opening up the conversation, allowing everybody in the chat to participate and provide their perspective. Thank you in the chat for sharing your stories and being willing to be open about your stories of what you've experienced. One thing I do want to mention that we had discussed, Rebecca, I think both Rebecca and Shayla and I have discussed it, of the online gaming format. Somebody mentioned it of.
Hold on 1 second. We couldn't hear. She's going to ask him to quit mowing.
You're
Sorry.
fine. Well, it would be perfect to give everybody just a moment to breathe.
So I talked about, or in the chat, I put like some of our local casinos in Sonoma County. So we have like Grayton, we have Dry Creek. And so with Dry Creek, what I know is that they busted a guy that they were watching him for not very long, and he had laundered like $800,000 through the casino. And so they arrested him. He was a sex trafficker, and they got a girl, I think she was like 14, 15 or 16 years old. They got him. So I know that our local ones are looking into that money laundering in the native casinos.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Madonna, for sharing.
And Rebecca, what I was saying, thank you for telling them to stop mowing. And you have a little chant in the chat of stop the mowers, which I think is great. But one thing I brought up was the online gaming aspect of using online chat profiles in the gaming chats to talk and try to traffic individuals. I've had a couple of friends who have experienced that, and it's actually something we discussed in our meeting prior to this.
That's a huge transition from COVID, that digital piece, like in all age groups. There are traffickers that are going to Minecraft. I know Minecraft's a little dated now, there's other things, but there's still kids, the younger age on that platform. And it's Xbox, it's social media, it's the gaming, it's OnlyFans, it's being recruited, it's sexting or texting or sending flirting messages and getting one pic from an innocent person. And then the trafficker's like, boom, I can make money off this, and just start advertising a fake OnlyFans page subscription or escort services just by one picture being texted to the wrong person. And these people are very savvy. COVID hit their wallets very hard. So yeah, the digital trafficking went exponentially larger. So it was a multi-billion-dollar industry before COVID, and now it's probably 4 times as much because of everyone's online. The kids have been living online, they're going to school online, we've been working online, and that is a huge reality. And I have teenage boys too, and they report back to me. And it's also an opportunity to educate our children about what it looks like. We don't have to go full board and tell them everything, but then When you educate the youth, they become youth allies. My children have shut down many people trying to recruit their friends in their gaming. What are they called?
Live online. friends?
Yeah, like campaigns. Yeah, a little group together, and they become mini advocates. It's very true.
I'm searching through the chat to see if there's any other.
Real, since someone's quiet, I guess I'll add that, you know, those chats and all those digital media stuff, it's one message, it's a numbers game. You know, they're just putting a fishtail out there and whoever they hit, and that's all they're doing. And they're taking advantage on. There's not enough moderation or law that's protecting these things to occur, especially in places where children can frequent.
And right in 2022, like our whole, like, not only just because of COVID, but right, like a lot of our youth live on devices, or especially with school and COVID, a lot of our schooling is on online platforms or.
Yeah, these vines or threads, these things where children are videoing themselves and people can just message and they're getting obscene or obscure things, and it's just it's everywhere. It's
Like
nonstop.
TikTok, like look how like fast and huge TikTok took off, and we have a lot of youth being exploited and recruited through TikTok, or videos, images, pictures taken from their profile.
I mean, even that's a victimization of itself. It's taking someone else's picture and profiling and using that to facilitate more trafficking.
Yeah, thank you, Mitchell.
And one thing, like friends of mine have talked about, because obviously I am a girl and I'm friends with other girls who are my age. But we will get Snapchat messages that if you open it and if you click, like accidentally click the link, they like turn on your location tracking through Snapchat.
Oh, yes, or even like when you're going through the airport, right? Like when some apps or some things can even just, if swipe, like go by your phone and just take your information.
The
that-
air tags.
Yes,
Mhm.
air tags. Thank you.
They are everywhere,
And
everywhere.
people talking about having their devices like Apple tracked. Nanny, I'm so sorry if I am mispronouncing your name, asked, why is it you hear a lot of people of all races going missing and or being trafficked, but rarely hear of these people getting caught, people doing the crimes being caught and prosecuted, question mark, question mark.
I feel like a huge reason why these crimes aren't getting caught or prosecuted. A lot of these reports and a lot of these crimes are not making their way to the prosecution's office, are not making their way to police to be reported. And that could just go a lot with violence in human trafficking, right? A lot of that manipulation, brainwash, addiction. We have a lot of survivors afraid to speak out because maybe they will be prosecuted instead of prosecuting their trafficker. And just those vulnerabilities, right? A lot of oppression in different racial communities, lack of resources, lack of response.
And the world is still trying to figure out jurisdiction over online digital content. The world is still trying to figure it out. And it's sad because that's where most trafficking is happening, the buying and selling and the recruitment. And then there's also, our indigenous issues with sovereignty, prosecution after Oliphant and Suquamish, where our ability to arrest non-natives on tribal land is not allowed still. So a lot of folks have generations of not reporting because law enforcement or the BIA or the FBI or state police departments will not support them. So why bother reporting? And that's a terrible historical trauma.
And on that historical trauma, and the fear of being re-victimized again, maybe it's not only by police, but whoever they feel comfortable in telling. A lot of times working with indigenous trafficking survivors, when we do go to the police and in that time of crisis, being trauma informed is so important, maybe so that they could understand that, yes, she's in crisis. She can't breathe because she's in fear of her life. Instead of a lot of times, just because of discrimination, we're turned away. They're like, are you sure she's just not high on drugs? Are you sure she's not drunk?
Right.
So I feel like a lot of that discrimination just kind of puts them in a place where they don't want to reach out for help. They don't want to be re-victimized, or maybe like they see like, what is the point?
What's the point? Yeah.
Mentioning sovereignty and regional landings and everything, Eleanor is going to be putting in the chat our previous session because we actually have a family member who discussed how at one point it was 3 police, federal and the tribal police involved in their case and fighting over who got to say what, who got to handle which thing. And although it's not online, but it's also that piece of trying to figure out who can prosecute, who can handle this matter. Absolutely.
And that gets so hard with jurisdiction, right? It's like, well, how can we move forward? Is it state or federal? Can you please let us know? And then even just the jurisdiction piece of it being unclear in human trafficking.
And there was a case, it was domestic violence, but that exact thing happened with Diane Millick, and she spoke at the White House and signed the Tribal Law and Order Act, and this is a well-known story. But there were tribal police, the BIA, the FBI, and the sheriff, and they took out measuring tapes and measured where the bullet and the bullet landed, and like measuring tapes. Not because they were fighting who got the case, they didn't want it. They were trying to pass it off on each other. And that's a lot of Indian country. I don't know, was it Diane that joined the other presentation, or Diane's family? Because that's a really well-known example of jurisdictional.
I am not certain but it might have been because I think it was an audience member that shared her story, but also it is the family member talking about just she got very lucky that her family member's case was Meskwaki police able to get involved. It's in the recording that Eleanor just posted as well. So feel free to take a watch.
And thank you, April Rogers, for mentioning, jurisdiction issues in tribal communities. We talked a lot about our tribal youth or tribal members being recruited off reservation, whether that's them voluntarily leaving or them being kidnapped off of the reservation. And we've run into wanting to report that crime off reservation, but off reservation law enforcement prosecution will be like, well, she's a tribal member, so we can't do because she needs to go back to the res and do that. And it's like, but no, the crime happened off tribal lands, off reservation jurisdiction.
Really sorry for our own housekeeping issues with the lawnmowers and the things, but I'm chasing them down. They've been really gracious. So I hope you've been having okay audio.
You sound good. If it helps.
Thank you so much for having us.
Any other questions before we begin closing? Oh, their email, of course. Thank you, Eleanor.
Did you want us to type it?
Can
do that.
If you could do that,
Okay.
or I think Eleanor might have it as well and she can send it. I apologize. I did not have that at the ready.
I'm gonna get it right now. We're good. Thank you. Yes, please reach out, even if it's, an off the record conversation and you're not emailing in a professional capacity. If we can support you supporting a friend, that's what we do.
Oh, actually, I have it. Yep, and I just sent it as well. Perfect. Oh, Mitchell asked, how can we help educate those in harmless ways?
Having conversations about, tech safety, talking to, just for an example, talking to a teenager, that there's a lot of people online that pretend like you can open with catfishing. Everyone knows what catfishing is. I think that people represent themselves of nothing that they are, that the endangerment of digital engagement is whoever you're talking to, you really don't know. And then that can branch into, well, what happens if someone's lying and you engage with them? What can happen next? In an age appropriate way where we don't have to open with conversations about violence, just about safety.
And like the age appropriate, right? Like human trafficking is intense, it's scary, all the violence, all the health disparities, and empowering our youth, right? Let's not fear them into their safety, let's empower them.
Yes.
And if you have any other questions, our last slide also has my contact info and you don't want to have to send that email, you can always reach out to me. I will be pulling up closing materials. We have our, oh, what does the R stand for in MMIR?
Relatives.
Yeah,
Mhm.
that was an effort, and a lot of folks are using it, but it was a conversation with MIWSAC that we weren't being inclusive, that it's not murdered and missing women, and then it became murdered and missing women and girls. And then we're thinking about, but that's not true. Boys get trafficked and experience violence, men do, and our two-spirit, non-gendered LGBTQ community, right? So we changed it to just relatives, so we didn't leave anyone behind, and the work included everyone. Thank you for asking that.
And with that, I am going to put up our closing slides. And if you have any other comments additional, we do not have to end the discussion now. We just want to make sure that we get out that you are not alone. If you're in immediate danger, you can consider calling 911 as well as the Strong Hearts Native Helpline. And then another project that Shayla and Rebecca mentioned right before we started is the Polaris project, which is the National Human Trafficking Hotline. And that is an opportunity where you can text rather than having to call, as well as submitting any information for missing and murdered Indigenous persons. You can submit to the Bureau of Indian Affairs Office of Justice Services. And Shayla and Rebecca, feel free to add anything on this slide because I know you mentioned a little bit.
I really appreciate, these are the two main. So the Strong Hearts Native Helpline, they do domestic violence, sexual violence, and trafficking. They're a resource center, so you can call them anytime. They're a wonderful group. That would be for our Indigenous folks. And then Polaris would serve all other folks. It's a mainstream organization. But if a Native calls Polaris Project, you'll still receive the same resources available and find a crisis advocate and things like that. Thank you so much for this slide. I think it's a good takeaway for folks.
And then just our closing slides with any closing comments or questions. And then my contact information is Elizabeth@UIOA. So if you have any questions that you would like me to send to Shayla and Rebecca and not prefer to contact them directly, please feel free to let me know. Oh, Caroline asked, do you know if Polaris released their research study form last year, trafficking among American Indian and Alaska Natives?
I saw their digital, their pandemic trafficking resource go out, but I have not seen a Native American one. But we do, MIWSAC has the Garden of Truth report that we referenced earlier, but Polaris is not sure. We didn't partner with them on any of that. You're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you. Kitatamin.
Thank you all for attending. With that, I think we are coming to a close. Thank you all for taking the time to listen. Thank you for presenting and sharing great knowledge. I hope you all can have a great rest of your Thursday and have a great rest of your week.